Everyone may be seated except for do you swear affirm to tell the truth, nothing but the truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. May be seated.
Thank you, ma'am.
Again, please state your name for the record.
James Fox.
Good morning, Sergeant Fox.
Good morning. Good morning, jury.
I want to sort of start where we left off. I think where we left off was Jim Perdue had radioed that these officers who had moved up were in his line of sight. And so I want to ask you from that point.
It's a mischaracterization of the evidence that he radioed that they were in his line of sight.
I'll ask a question, Judge, to establish that. Did Mr. Officer Perdue put out over the radio that these officers were somehow interfering with his ability to see Mr. Boyd?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Why did he tell them that over the radio?
Because one of his jobs is to, again, collect intel and to also provide overwatch. Overwatch is basically covering the movements of the arrest team or the entry team.
Okay. After he put that out over the radio, was Officer Perdue able to move to a location where he could continue to do his job, that is, provide intel and provide cover?
No, he was not.
Okay. Would it refresh your recollection to see whether he was able to provide intel after that by looking at page 44 of the radio transcripts?
Yes, he was still able to provide some intel.
Okay. And did he have the ability to move from one location to another?
Based on the train, I'm not sure if he was able to or he was not able to. I know that one of their jobs is to keep concealed if possible, so he may not have found a better spot or he may just made the decision not to move. So I'm not real sure what his decision was at that point.
Okay. Do you know how he was later able to provide over the radio some intel about what Mr. Boyd was doing?
I do not.
Okay. What intel did he provide about, after he'd said, I need to let you know you're between me and the subject, what intel was he able to provide through his scope after that point in time?
Your Honor, I object as to relevance after the shooting of Mr. Boyd.
It's not after the shooting, Judge. It's before the shooting. So it's between the time that he said, I can't see you, and when the shooting happened. He was able to provide intel on Mr. Boyd.
If it was before the shooting.
Sure. That's exactly what I'm asking. Okay.
Officer Perdue was able to relay information that James Boyd was changing, putting on a sweatshirt.
And why would that be important information to relay over the radio?
If it changed his description, I mean, originally it came out that he had dark shirt, dark pants. If the sweatshirt was a different color, then he would want everybody on the perimeter and the arrest team or entry team, the command post, to know that his description had changed slightly. And there are times where people put on layers of clothes if they know that or are expecting some type of force from officers.
Okay, and do you know if Mr. Boyd put on the sweatshirt because he was getting cold or he put on the sweatshirt because he was expecting force from officers? Do you know one way or the other?
I do not.
Okay. What else could it affect? Why else would Officer Perdue relay that information over the air that he was putting on a sweatshirt? What else might it affect?
As far as description, and then again, like I said, any type of, if Mr. Boyd was expecting any type of use of force from officer, maybe to layer himself to protect himself.
Okay, did Officer Perdue actually put over the radio that the putting on the sweatshirt might affect the taser shotgun in some way?
He did.
Objection leading, Your Honor.
Okay. What did he tell the officers over the air about how the putting on the sweatshirt might affect the taser shotgun?
Objection leading, Your Honor.
I think it was what did he tell?
Right, correct, Judge.
He made a statement to the fact that he thought that James Boyd was putting on a sweatshirt to maybe hamper the ability of the taser.
And why would he tell the officers that over the air? Why was that important for the officers to know?
Just to provide them more information, let them know that that might affect one of their tools, which was less lethal.
Okay, and he told them that over the air, did he tell them that over the air before the shooting happened?
He did.
Now, in this time period, when was it that you, well, let me back up. Before you ever arrived, were you trying to do what you had talked to us about yesterday, that is gather intel on what was going on at the scene?
Yes, I was trying to gather as much intel as I could as I was in my driveway changing and to the scene. I was trying to gather as much as I could.
And who did you talk to about, and who did you rely upon to gather intel before you even arrived at the scene?
Officer Ken Ronzone gave me some good intel, and then I was listening to the radio that provided me some intel.
Did you actually talk to Jason Carpenter, who was at the scene?
When I arrived at the scene, prior to, as we explained yesterday, is when I called him originally, and he told me what he had.
And then said he didn't make it a SWAT call at that point, I think is what you said.
That's correct.
Right. All right, Your Honor, when you arrived at the scene, did you ask Sergeant Carpenter about whether there were any charges on Mr. Boyd?
Yes, I asked Sergeant Carpenter kind of a basic, what do we have? I understood just from talking to Officer Ken Ronzone, who is a K-9 tactical officer, that we possibly may have aggravated assault charges with a deadly weapon, and I inquired to Sergeant Carpenter about that.
And what was Sergeant Carpenter's answer?
He informed me he wasn't real sure, at which point I said, this is the information I had. Let's start a detective so we can continue our investigation.
Okay, and I'm sorry, he said he wasn't sure if he had aggravated assault charges?
That's correct.
Who was in charge, or were you able to figure out who was in charge out there at the scene?
It would have been Sergeant Carpenter that would be in charge of that scene.
How did you find the scene as far as being organized or confusing?
There was a lot of moving parts. It was fluid. It was developing. There was a lot of tasks that I felt that we needed to complete to kind of slow the situation down.
And what were you trying to do down there at the house? What tasks were you trying to do to slow the situation down?
I'm building upon all of the criteria that I explained yesterday as far as establishing inner perimeter, outer perimeter, the command post. I'm trying to gather intel, what else do we have here. So I'm doing all of those things in the event to make it an actual SWAT activation.
All right. You said Jason Carpenter was in charge. What does that mean that he was in charge before you arrived? What would that mean to the other officers who were there?
He would be running the scene.
Okay. And what would that mean as far as whether the officers would need to check in with him before doing anything?
It's usually protocol that an officer will check in with a supervisor, especially if you're getting moved to perimeter positions, so that supervisor can keep track and document kind of where you're at as far as on the scene.
Okay. And when you arrived, then who was in charge?
When I arrived then, I assumed responsibility of the scene. I realized how much needed to be done, so I divided some of the responsibility, and I wanted Sergeant Carpenter to go ahead and start running the outer perimeter. And then I would take the inner perimeter and the scene itself.
Okay. And is the same true once you were there? Does the same rule apply that officers who were going to do something should have checked in with you before they did something?
If they're just arriving, they would. If they're already in place, then I try to figure out where they're at already in place. And again, not to tie up radio air with a bunch of chatter or dialogue. I'll usually get with the supervisor on scene and find out where everybody's at. If it's a situation that's evolving and they don't have time, then I'll do my best to figure out over the air quickly where everybody's located.
After you arrived, did the group of Sandy, Ingram, and Weimerskirch ever communicate to you that they were moving from their position below up to the top of the hill?
No.
Did you have some communications directly with Defendant Sandy?
Briefly over the air, and I don't recall exactly what was said, but I think I've had one transmission maybe. Most of my transmissions to that entry arrest group were to Officer Scott Weimerskirch.
Okay. Can you, would it refresh your recollection about your conversation with Defendant Sandy to look at page 43 of the radio log there?
Yeah, it did.
Can you describe your discussions with Defendant Sandy over the radio?
Your Honor, I'm just going to object based on the broad nature of the question. She referred to 43. In order to put it all in context, 42 is required too from a refresher's memory.
Let me
That's-
ask the witness to review page 4.
That's fine, Judge.
Before answering.
Okay.
Okay. Can you describe your conversation with
Sure.
Defendant Sandy, please?
At one point, I contact Detective Sandy and let him know, make him aware that he's going to have officers to the east on the inner perimeter, so they know where they're at, once again, to avoid a crossfire. And then a little bit after that, another transmission with Detective Sandy is he's explaining that they've moved their position a little further east, and they have negotiations with him, but he is still refusing to comply with their negotiations. He's agitated.
Okay. And was it shortly after that that you heard from Jim Perdue that there was a problem with him being able to see Mr. Boyd?
Yeah, that was the explanation he gave of not able to cover them just because they were in his line of sight.
Okay. Did you make any requests of the Weimerskirch, Sandy, Ingram group about whether they had enough less lethal up there?
I did,
Okay. And why did you ask them that?
because that's one of my responsibilities as a supervisor when I come onto a scene, is to make sure that every perimeter position also has a...
Your Honor, I'm going to object now as a mischaracterization of the evidence that he spoke to Sandy about less lethal or Ingram. He spoke to Weimerskirch, so that question is very misleading by saying...
Speaking objection, Your Honor.
Sustained in regard to speaking objection and sustained with regard to Mr. Bregman.
Okay. Who did you speak to about the less lethal?
I contacted Officer Scott Weimerskirch.
Okay. And what did he say about whether they needed more or less lethal up there?
He said he needed more or less lethal if I could send somebody up.
And what did he say that he needed?
Radio transmissions were bad just because of the area, and so we did a lot of repeating. Transmissions would come in incomplete, but eventually I found out that he needed a impact tool, which would be a beanbag shotgun. I originally said I was going to send a taser shotgun up, and he said, "We already have that. Can you send me a beanbag?"
And what were you able to relay to him that you were going to send a beanbag shotgun up?
Yes.
And what did you do to make good on that?
About that time, Officer Perez, Officer Ramon and Ellis both showed up pretty much at the same time. I said, "Hey, we need a beanbag shotgun up to that position." Officer Ramon and Ellis said, "I have one in my car. It's right here. I'll go get it." And so he went to go retrieve the beanbag shotgun.
All right. And what did you do with Officer Perez?
I sent Officer Perez up to the entry arrest team.
Okay. And whose choice was it to send him up there?
That was mine.
And he went on your order?
He absolutely did.
Okay. Did Officer Perez have anything to do with whatever plan they had up at the top of the mountain between Weimerskirch, Sandy, and Ingram?
No. Once he arrived, he checked in with me, as he always has, and that was expected of him. And then I sent him directly to that area. Don't have to relay much information to tactical officers. They know kind of exactly what they need to do when they get there. They take a quick evaluation, and then they fill in a role.
Okay. And can you tell the jury how you feel about having to come testify when it's one of your guys who's on trial here?
Objection relevant.
Well,
I think it is relevant, Judge.
Can you repeat the question, ma'am?
Yes, sir. Can you tell this jury how it feels to have to come testify in this case where one of your guys is on trial?
Horrible. I regret calling Officer Perez every single day. But he did what he was asked of him. He followed in my order. If it hadn't have been for him, it would have been another tactical officer, because they all are trained exactly the same.
Okay. Thanks, Sergeant Fox. Did Weimerskirch, Sandy, or Ingram, did you ever talk to Ingram on the radio at all?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so let me ask you only about Sandy or Weimerskirch. Did either one of those people ever communicate to you what their plan was before Mr. Boyd got shot?
No.
Did you at some point ask them if they had a plan, or did you ask them to put a plan in place?
Your Honor, I'm going to object then. She needs to be more specific about who she asked without him.
that's the vague sustain.
Sure. Did you ask anybody up on the Hill to put a plan in place before they did anything?
Over the air, Scott Weimerskirch had informed me that they had a plan in place. I believe it was a couple times. And then I actually got on the air just to verify, do you have a plan in place? So it's expected of tactical officers, and Officer Scott Weimerskirch is a tactical officer, that when they get to a scene, they start developing plans. Even though they're not in a supervisor role, their advanced training allows them to get to a scene and start making things happen just in case, or to prevent any kind of a problem. They start coming up with a small plan.
Okay. And at what point in the process did you ask him that he was going to have to come up with a plan? And if you can look at 46, maybe, if you need to refresh your recollection.
I'm going to object. There are pages before that to discuss the plan, too.
What page would make it?
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
What page would make it?
I just need 1 minute, Your Honor, please. Thank you. 44. 43.
Judge, I'm trying to time when this conversation had where he asked them that they needed to come up with a plan.
Let me have Mr. Britton continue.
43, 44, and the page that you mentioned. There's 3 different instances, right?
So, Sergeant Fox, if you'll start on page 43 and review to page 46, where we begin to.
Yes, Your Honor. Okay.
You may ask the question.
All right. I even forget what my question was now, Judge. At what point before the shooting did you tell Officer Weimerskirch that he needed to develop a plan?
And again, over the transmissions, Officer Scott Weimerskirch on 2 separate occasions told me they had a plan. When I verified and said, do you guys have a plan, he had just commented that the James Boyd was not responding to their commands or negotiations and was talking about walking down from that hill.
Okay. And then what did you say to him when he said James Boyd wants to walk down the hill with all of his bags? What did you actually say over the radio?
that, does he have a plan in place?
Okay, and he said he did.
That's correct.
All right.
Your Honor, that is not a complete statement of what was said.
I'll let you address that on cross-examination.
Thank you.
Let me pull this out and take a look at this class. Okay, so let's go to 46. That's where I'm asking you about, Sergeant Fox, and let's make sure we're accurate. Can you tell the jury exactly what Officer Weimerskirt said over the radio, and then what you said in response?
Yes, again, he mentions that James Boyd's not complying with any of their commands or negotiations. He wants to walk down from the hill. I advise him I'm sending Ramon Ornelas to come up to that position and for them guys to come up with a plan.
And what exactly did you say? If you can just read from that thing.
Sure.
Let's just consider that's not complete.
What exactly did you say about coming up with a plan?
I'm going to send 14. 14 would be Ramon Ornelas' call sign. He's going to be with a beanbag. I'm going to have you guys come up with a plan, if possible, for nightfall to take him into custody for his safety and ours.
Okay. And after that discussion, were you able to have a discussion with Sergeant Perdue, excuse me, Jim Perdue, I don't think he was a sergeant then.
No, ma'am.
Okay. Officer Perdue, about what he could see after that comment. Well, let me ask it this way. Who did you talk to next after that comment to Sergeant Weimerskirt?
I then would have talked to Ramon Ornelas as he was moving up to that position.
Okay. And over the radio, who was your next contact with?
I don't recall it. I have to.
Okay, please take a look.
Page you see here.
46. And specifically, I'm asking whether Jim Perdue was still being able to provide you with information at that particular point in time.
He was still able to provide some.
Okay, and then in the next minute or so after you had that conversation, what did you hear from the mountainside?
I heard a noise flash diversionary device. That's a technical term for a flashbang. It's a device that goes off, makes a loud explosion, bright light. And then I heard what sounded like commands to a police service dog, and then shortly after a volley of what sounded like gunshots.
Okay. And could you see what happened up there on the mountainside?
No.
Okay. By the time the shots were fired, what things did the officers who were on the radio know about Mr. Boyd, as far as what weapons might actually work on him or not?
Objection, speculation.
It's from what's on the radio, Judge.
Well, he hasn't been on the radio the entire time. He's already said that.
All right, well, let me ask it this way. At the time of the shooting, was this after this discussion that you talked about earlier today, where Jim Perdue had come on the radio and said he's putting on a sweatshirt, it may affect the taser shotgun?
Objection leading, Your Honor.
Okay.
The conversation over the police radio with James Perdue about the changing of the sweatshirt was before.
Okay, and because, and Officer Weimerskirt and Officer Sandy were both on the radio and using the radio during that time period, weren't they?
Yeah, Officer Weimerskirt's more, but both I had communicated with Detective Sandy and then most of my transmissions to Officer Weimerskirt.
Okay. Before you heard the noise of the flashbang, Was your SWAT officer, Ornelas, had he gotten up to the scene yet with the beanbag shotgun?
No, he was approximately from my makeshift command post in the backyard of the where the call took place. He was about 50 yards from my position and probably had another 35 to 45 yards to get to their position. So he was probably halfway.
Okay, and what did he have with him?
The beanbag shotgun.
Okay. Do you know why Officers Weimerskirch, Sandy, and Ingram didn't know there were already 2 beanbag shotguns there at the scene?
Objection calls for speculation. There's no evidence of such.
I think the question is, does he know? So
Right.
that calls for a yes or no. And
Okay.
Sorry, ma'am, can you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. Do you know why the officers up there that went up to where Mr. Boyd was didn't know that there were already at least 2 beanbag shotguns there at the scene?
Judge, the question implies facts that are not in evidence. Objection.
Okay. Were there other beanbag shotguns? Did you come to find later there were other beanbag shotguns that were already there on the scene before you arrived?
Objection leading.
Okay. What did you find out about the other beanbag shotguns that were there at the scene?
I didn't know if there were any at the scene or not. And
Okay.
that's why, again, I took some time to check in with all the perimeter positions to make sure they had some form of less lethal.
Okay. If there were already beanbag shotguns there on scene, can you explain why the officers didn't know that there were already beanbag shotguns on scene?
Objection. Relevance and calls for speculation.
with regard to speculations, sustained.
Okay. Should the officers who were on the scene have known what tools they had available on the scene?
If they had the time.
Okay. Do you know how long Weimerskirch, Ingram, and Sandy had been there at the time you arrived?
I do not.
Let's talk about what you were able to establish in the 10, 13 minutes that you were there.
Okay.
You had talked to the jury about establishing a perimeter. What were you able to do as far as establishing a perimeter during the short time you were there?
I had a pretty good inner perimeter. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good. There were some gaps in it, just from my experience in that area. I knew that once nightfall came, that it would be definitely difficult to keep that inner perimeter and keep that integrity of that inner perimeter, to keep someone from slipping through it. I was concerned about how we were going to get lighting up there. I wanted to make sure that each side, again, of the perimeter had, lethal and less lethal options available to them.
Can I stop you just for a second? Because you mentioned that yesterday too, and I forgot to ask you. Why do you want each side of the perimeter to have both lethal and less lethal options? Why is that?
Because you can't always expect that a suspect is going to come directly to the entry team or the arrest team. You have to prepare for the unpredictable. And if a suspect decides that I'm going to flee north, then you have to have officers who are prepared similar to the arrest team.
Okay, and why do you have less lethal in addition to lethal?
Because if there's a chance that we can incapacitate the suspect and place him into custody without using deadly force, then that's what we can do.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I interrupted you about
No.
talking about the perimeters. Sergeant Fox.
No, that's no problem. So the inner perimeter was going to have to do for then. It was able to let me slow down slightly. My next step was I had Officer Ramon Ornelas, Officer Perez step up. I told Officer Ramon Ornelas, again, he was a team leader. One of his roles is to develop a plan. And when he develops a plan, we talk about it. And that's based on his experience and his good decision making. Officer Perez is sent immediately up to that position because I was informed that they needed more bodies, more individuals to help. And then Officer Ornelas was given that information, and I authorized less lethal if it fits the criteria. He began moving that direction. And then my next step was to then activate the rest of the tactical team, which again, as we explained yesterday, involves the crisis negotiation team. I already had rescue standing by, and that was good planning on Jason Carpenter's part, the sergeant. He had them standing by already. And then I was going to switch probably all of the responsibilities for the outer perimeter to Jason Carpenter. And that would help me, and I wouldn't have to multitask quite as much.
Okay. Did you have a time limit on how long you were willing to stay up there to try to resolve this successfully?
No, suspects usually kind of dictate the time, but I felt that if we could safely place him into custody before nightfall, it would be more safe for officers and members of the public, just because of, again, my experience, the terrain, the wide open space, the citizens that were walking back and forth on the trail enjoying the day.
Okay. If you had been designing the arrest team to go up there and do that before nightfall, what things would be important to you to make sure that he was arrested safely and your officers were safe?
Subject relevant to it.
Were you able to put into place an arrest plan to take him into custody before nightfall, before he was shot?
No.
Did you, I think we've talked about the three that were up there never relayed to you what their plan was, did they?
Objection implies facts are not in evidence. That it was his plan, that Mr. Sandy's plan. No, I object to that question.
All right. The question is, did you ever learn either before the shooting or after the shooting which one of those three officers had been assigned to be the hands-on officer to arrest Mr. Boyd?
Objection has an answer, Your Honor.
It's never been asked. Yeah.
I'm sorry, ma'am. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Either beforehand or after during the investigation, were you ever told by any of the three of them, Weimerskirch, Sandy, or Ingram, which one of the three of them in their plan had been assigned to be the hands-on person to arrest Mr. Boyd?
No.
Does the SWAT team have special equipment to deal with nighttime negotiations like this?
We have night vision capabilities. Not everybody on the team has that equipment. It's very expensive. And then a lot of times we have portable lights, but those require some kind of a power source.
And did Defendant Perez have night vision goggles? Do you know?
I believe he was issued some, yes.
Okay. And we've talked about Jim Perdue, the fellow who was out, high ground officer is what you call him.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, high ground officer. He never shot at any time during this altercation, did he?
Objection has an answer, Your Honor.
Okay. And do you know that Jim Perdue has also another job with the military that causes him to be deployed?
Objection relevant, Your Honor.
All right, 1 second, Your Honor, please. Do you know whether Jim Perdue is currently deployed overseas?
Objection, Your Honor.
Okay. I'll pass the witness then, Your Honor. Thanks.
Your Honor, if you could switch it to the prosecution table, DGA, please.
Sergeant Fox, I'd like to ask you a series of questions, some of which touch on topics that you talked about yesterday, and I don't want to belabor those topics, and then go into some detail about topics that you did not have an opportunity to talk about.
Okay.
So I know yesterday you began with an explanation of your experience in training. Is that
Yes, sir.
right? Now, you graduated from Metro State College in Denver, is that right?
Yes, sir.
You testified that yesterday.
Yes, sir.
You have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice
That's correct, sir.
and a minor in business management.
Yes, sir.
And you have a family, I guess I should say, there's a family history that you have of members of your family being in law enforcement.
That's correct, sir.
You have a great uncle who's one of the original highway patrolmen in Wyoming.
Yes, sir.
Your father's in law enforcement.
Yes, he was.
And then you became a law enforcement officer, is that right?
I did.
Why did you choose to become an officer with the Albuquerque Police Department?
I grew up in Wyoming and then eventually moved to Colorado, and Albuquerque Police Department had an awesome reputation. Everywhere I went, and as far as college, and I went out to go to other schools that I paid for on my own, it was always mentioned that Albuquerque Police Department had some of the best training and a really good department. So, never been to Albuquerque in my life. I came out here and applied. I didn't know my way around, and luckily got accepted, and I've been here ever since.
Now, you talked about being a member of the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you were a member, I think, 7 years, is that correct?
7.5, sir.
And in those 7.5 years, how much experience did you have in terms of SWAT call-outs addressing individuals who were suicidal or mentally ill?
Actually, it would be all 22 years of my career. I've had some experience. It increased once I became a member of the SWAT team with that type of situation.
Are you able to place a number on the number of call-outs that you responded to as a SWAT team member that involved individuals who were suicidal or mentally ill?
Starting from the time I became a
Yes.
SWAT officer to start. Hundreds and hundreds.
Okay. And you were a field sergeant, just like Sergeant Carpenter.
Yes, sir.
And you understand, working as a field sergeant, that you have certain limitations and with what you have available to you.
Absolutely.
So when you saw what Sergeant Carpenter was dealing with, you knew from personal experience there's only so much a field sergeant can do. Is that right?
Yes, and that's why we have available resources that we can always send a field sergeant.
So you would agree with me that as a SWAT team sergeant, you have more resources available to you than a typical field sergeant.
Yes.
And you, as a SWAT team sergeant, have available to you more resources than Sergeant Carpenter would in March of 2014.
That's correct.
So when Sergeant Carpenter is working with what he has, you would agree with me that it would be unfair to judge Sergeant Carpenter by the standards that you are being judged.
Yes.
And the reason for that is that you have available to you much more than Sergeant Carpenter ever would.
Absolutely.
Now, as a sergeant, one of the tasks that you had was recording the number of call-outs, actually keeping statistics for the team. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
How many times was the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team activated or called out in the year 2014?
2014, we had 39 activations.
And how many times was the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team activated or called out in April of 2014?
6 times that month.
Okay. Is that generally how much work a SWAT team officer is expected to perform with regard to activations over the course of a year, 40 or so activations?
No, that was actually a year where we didn't have as many prior experience on the tactical team. We've had as many as 100 or over a year, 80 a year. So the average was always around 80 to 100, and that year we had less.
And how many years did you end up working for the Albuquerque Police Department?
22.
And now you're currently working as a law enforcement officer, is that right?
That's correct.
And where are you working?
I work for Santa Ana Pueblo Police Department at this time.
Now I'd like to talk to you about Officer Perez. Now, how did you first come to meet Officer Perez?
2006, when I was promoted to a field sergeant and I left the tactical team, I was assigned to the Foothills Area Command, and I met Officer Perez. He was also assigned to the Foothills Area Command, but he was in a different squad.
Okay. Based on your experience as a sergeant working in field services during the same time period that Officer Perez was a field services officer, what sense did you have about Officer Perez as a police officer?
He was a great police officer. I was very encouraged to hear that he was going to actually put in for the SWAT team. I know from watching him in the field and talking to his sergeant that he made good decisions. He was a hard worker.
Now, there came a time when you became Officer Perez's sergeant, is that right?
That's correct.
Approximately when did that occur?
Right around 2010 or a little before.
Okay. And in your capacity, or I guess I should say, please explain the relationship that you had, the professional one, with Officer Perez when you first became a supervisor.
He was expected to perform tasks just like all the other tactical officers were. I watched him during training, and he always gave 110%. He was a dream officer. We pay him for 40, and he'd give me 80. He was dependable, and he would, under stressful situations, would make good decisions. Never problems. I had no disciplinary reports. I had no use of force reports against Officer Perez during that time.
Now, you said that you had watched Officer Perez in training. As a SWAT team sergeant, how do you use the information you learn from watching your officers in training to help assess whether they will be good or maybe not so good SWAT team officers?
Because we're a close-knit, your peers put a lot of pressure on you to maintain a certain degree of excellence. As a supervisor, I was required to go to training days, and I would watch, and if we found problems, then we would address them, maybe some retraining. We would maybe pull that officer in, explain to them, talk to them about maybe a problem they had during training. Ultimately, a lot of times you get a good feel of the caliber of SWAT officer you have during training. Now, training isn't the say-all as far as how good you are as a tactical officer, but it gives you a kind of a benchmark.
Okay. Now, you also had an opportunity to watch Officer Perez work during SWAT team activations, is that correct?
Yes, numerous times.
Now, how many years did you have the opportunity to watch Officer Perez work during SWAT team activations?
4 years.
And approximately how many activations do you believe you watched Officer Perez work?
We had some busy years during that time. I want to say, right around probably 400 type of situations that we were activated to.
During those 400 or so activations that you watched Officer Perez doing his work, what sense did you get about him and his ability to perform in a real world situation?
He was stellar. I put a lot of responsibility on Officer Perez because I felt that he was going to be the future of the team. We would be grooming him for probably assistant team leader or team leader. And like I explained, those are positions, they're an informal leadership position, but it's based on your work performance, your leadership qualities, your drive, your motivation, your disciplinary record, use of force record.
Would it be fair to say that during the time you came to know Officer Perez, you also learned about Officer Perez's military background?
I did.
What did you know about Officer Perez's military background?
Officer Perez is very humble. I found out that he actually served 2 tours in Iraq. During those 2 tours, he did see combat. During his second tour, he was gravely injured, and he was awarded the Purple Heart.
Now, how did Officer Perez's military training and experience impact his work on your SWAT team?
With experience working with combat veterans, I found that they bring a sense of clarity and calmness to a stressful situation, to a critical incident. And they're able to handle that incident a lot better than someone who hasn't had those same life experiences.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention, and I believe do you remember being asked in your direct examination about SWAT team training?
Yes, sir.
Now, you also asked about the initial process by which a SWAT team officer is sort of, I guess, processed or brought onto the team?
That's correct.
And that's, I guess, called the initial screening process.
Yes, it is.
Would you please explain the process that a SWAT officer must undergo in order to be a member of your SWAT team?
We have to have openings. The openings are announced. Officers then fill out an application through the department, goes through personnel. During that time, it is handed to the tactical commander, is lieutenant rank. He looks and reviews their disciplinary record and their use of force record. And any problems with either one of those records, you're disqualified. And then from there, if you're allowed to continue on with the process, then we have several different types of tests that measure what we expect in a tactical officer.
Given the fact that Officer Perez became a member of the APD SWAT team, what does that say about Officer Perez's background with regard to a use of force history or a disciplinary record?
He was above and beyond what we expect of officers. He had no problems whatsoever.
Okay. Now, how many times, if any, has any citizen ever filed a complaint against Officer Perez for any sort of misconduct?
No citizens ever filed any type of misconduct complaint.
Now, what I'd like to do is ask you about the foundations upon which all SWAT team training is based. First, I'd like to ask you about the concept of contact cover and how it relates to the work that a SWAT team officer does. So the question is essentially, would you please explain the concept known as contact cover?
Sure. Contact cover is a basic tactic that all police officers learn in the academy. It's the very basics. It's the safest way for officers to interview or make contact with a subject out in the field. Your contact officer will be the officer who does the interviewing. He's asking the questions. He may be writing down information in his notebook. Your cover officer is your scene security. He's watching 360 degrees. He's in a position of advantage. He's watching for possible escape routes. He's watching the subject's hands. Are those hands going for a concealed weapon? Are they going for a weapon of opportunity? He does very little verbal communication with the contact officer unless there's danger, and then he will alert to him if he has the ability or if he has the time. That cover officer is also a lethal option if need be.
So it's fair to say that every officer with the Albuquerque Police Department, to your knowledge, is taught contact cover.
Yes.
And then this concept, known as contact cover, then becomes part of what the SWAT team, more than just two officers, does. Is that right?
That's correct.
Before I get there, let me ask you this question. What downside is there if an officer both serves as a contact and a cover officer? For himself, I should say.
If an officer is doing contact and cover himself, he is missing vital information, maybe some kind of a statement or some kind of explanation of why they're there in the first place, what he's investigating. He misses bits and pieces. But the biggest thing is he's missing those behavioral cues, those aggressive cues. The subject's hands, has the subject produced a weapon? He's multitasking and can put himself into a great threat.
Now, talking about the role of a contact officer, what training did Officer Perez receive regarding the role of a SWAT team member who serves as a contact officer?
And contact cover doesn't really change as the basic tactics when you get into tactical. It becomes, we do it so much, repetition during training, that it becomes second nature. It's more fluid, it's more orchestrated. There's less verbal communication. We all know, during training, that if someone's making contact, that person is the only one making contact.
Now, during a SWAT activation, who makes contact with a subject or a suspect?
Crisis negotiation team.
Now, why don't you ask cover officers to make contact with the suspect?
Again, we're going into that area of multitasking. The cover officer has one job, and that is scene security, keeping himself safe and his fellow officers safe, or members of the community that happen to be in the area.
Now, turning your attention to the role of a cover officer, what type of training did Officer Perez receive regarding the role of a SWAT team member who serves as a cover officer?
We constantly trained scenarios, role-playing. We have what we call simunitions training. Simunitions allows us to shoot plastic projectiles at each other. If you're doing something that we feel is, a threat, it gauges us to a little bit more realistic. He's participated in those type of training exercises. There's decisional shoot exercises and a multitude of other exercises, vehicle stops, active shooter. It's in place, contact and cover with almost everything that we respond to.
Now, still focusing in on the role of a cover officer and then integrating less lethal munitions, that's the topic I'd like to talk about next.
Okay.
Would you please explain how the use of less lethal munitions are trained to cover officers and the role that less lethal munitions would have with regard to their use by cover officers?
So we would call that a layered response. If we had an arrest team or an entry team, everybody assigned a particular less lethal tool. Again, someone's hands-on, someone is a contact, and then we have someone who is a cover officer. And again, that cover officer, his job is lethal cover.
Now, you talked about a layered response. Why would you have a layered less lethal response if you have officers who are there who have a firearm, can use it to provide lethal cover?
Because not all encounters are lethal, and having multiple tools available to us as less lethal, it's a greater chance of a successful outcome.
Now, turning that question around, why do you have lethal or deadly force cover if you have available to you a layered less lethal response?
Less lethal is man-made technology. It fails. There's been several from training and my experience seeing less lethal completely fail. Again, from experience, some less lethal options just don't affect certain people. There are some people who can take many different forms of less lethal and it doesn't bother them. You always have to have a lethal option in case all of the less lethal options fail.
So is it fair to say that when you send a SWAT officer to a situation in which there is a layered less lethal response, you always want to have a firearm available if a deadly force situation arises?
That's correct. That is trained to all police officers, not just SWAT, is a complement with less lethal, there's always lethal.
So you mentioned other police officers. Would you please explain, again, you were a field services officer, you were a field sergeant, what other Albuquerque Police Department officers are taught about this notion called the force array?
I believe most officers are exposed to it on a probably not as a great a scale as when tactical shows up, but in the field you always have in a force array is a term that your command presence, it starts with that. There are different types of less lethal between that and lethal. And it provides you the ability to escalate depending on the subject's actions or de-escalate. It moves very fluidly up and down.
Now, with regard to the way in which field services officers work together, to what extent, based on your experience working as both a field officer and a patrol sergeant, are field services officers trained to work together to provide each other with contact cover and also provide a force array?
They are trained, but not as repetitive as a tactical officer.
Now, to what extent are those field services officers trained to service contact cover for each other and use the force array?
On actual events, every day they're putting those skills to use. Again, they go back to the police academy where they're taught those basics, and then some in-service training, there's refreshers on that.
Now, what has been your experience watching Officer Perez involved in situations in which the APD SWAT team uses essentially a layered less lethal response with also deadly force cover?
That concept is used on every activation that we go on. That's always a component that's put into place. So his experience is every single activation on top of all of the training that we provide using those tactics.
Now, what is an APD SWAT officer taught about the role that a firearm would serve when they work as a cover officer?
They are going to be the lethal option.
Now, what training did Officer Perez receive regarding the proper response when a cover officer sees an immediate deadly threat posed to another officer?
Again, that's police academy. You learn that if a cover officer sees an immediate deadly threat to the contact officer himself or a member of the community, he is to deploy deadly force.
Based on based on the training Officer Perez was given, was Officer Perez instructed that if a contact officer made a mistake and created a dangerous situation for him or herself, what would be Officer Perez's role serving as a cover officer?
His role, if, again, seeing deadly threat, is to perform a lethal option. He's to deploy deadly force. And that's, again, ingrained in our department SOP, use of force section.
Now, to be very clear, if an officer makes a mistake that puts them in jeopardy of being seriously injured, is it correct to say that Officer Perez was taught that he should use deadly force if the suspect posed an immediate threat of serious bodily harm to that officer?
Yes.
Would you agree that it is Officer Perez's duty to use deadly force if a fellow officer faces a threat of serious physical harm from a suspect?
Yes, it is.
Part of the question, Your Honor, left out the immediate.
Okay, I will re-ask that question. You would agree with me that it is Officer Perez's duty to use deadly force if a fellow officer was faced with an immediate threat of serious bodily harm?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you spoke about ultimate responsibility in your direct examination. Do you remember using those words?
Yes.
That as a supervisor, you have the ultimate responsibility for the decisions you make.
Yes.
That when you make decisions involving your subordinate officers, you're responsible for the consequences of your decisions.
That's correct.
So that when you make a decision to deploy an officer to perform a particular task, that officer is under your orders to do that task.
They are.
And that an officer who's your subordinate is expected to do as you instruct them.
That's correct.
And you would expect nothing less of Officer Perez. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct.
And when you instructed Officer Perez to go to the location where Mr. Boyd was positioned, that was your decision.
That was my decision and my decision only.
Officer Perez didn't volunteer to go there.
He did not.
You ordered him to go there.
I called him and had him come to the scene, and then once he arrived at the scene, I put him in that position.
Let me back up because there's, I think, a piece that hasn't been discussed. What did you do to bring Officer Perez out to this mountainside?
I needed assistance just based on, again, on my experience and my training out in that area of Albuquerque. I knew that I couldn't do it on my own, and I'm going to need some help if it truly is going to be a SWAT activation. So I made the call to, again, Officer Perdue, because of his skill set, Officer Ramon Ornelas, a team leader. He's going to help develop plans, run the entry team, arrest team, and then I called Officer Perez based on his past performance, his dependability, and good decision making.
Now, how many SWAT team officers were on the APD SWAT team in March of 2014, more or less?
Boy, anywhere between 18 and maybe 20. I want to say 18.
So is it fair to say that you chose to call just 3 officers initially?
Yes.
Officer Ornelas, your team leader.
Correct?
Officer Jim Perdue, who was the high ground officer.
Yes, sir.
And then Officer Perez, is that right?
That's correct.
So you had 18 people from which to choose, but you chose only 3.
That's correct.
Why did you choose to ask Officer Perez to respond to this call as opposed to any of the other team members who would be available to you?
Again, he's dependable. I knew he made good decisions. I knew that I could direct him to a position, and he would make that position work. And during that time, he would follow the SOP. He would follow all of the rules set in place by the department. And that is the reason I called him.
Now, I believe the word you said was horrible about the way you feel, about the decision that you made.
That's correct.
But you would also agree with me that if a similar situation was to appear in the future, you would once again call on someone like Officer Perez because of who he is.
Objection, Your Honor, relevant.
I'm sorry, sir. Can you repeat?
So let me back up. You feel horrible, those are your words, correct?
Yes.
About the decision you made that sent Officer Perez
Yes.
to the location where Mr. Boyd was placed, is that right?
That's correct.
But you would agree with me that if you were in the same situation again, under the same facts, and had to call upon someone to do this kind of work, you would still call on Officer Perez, is that right?
Absolutely. It's one of the unfortunate things about being a supervisor. There's things that you have to do.
Now, it was a choice on your part.
Yes,
It's a choice that I believe you must feel a certain amount of guilt over
I do.
because of everything that has happened since.
Absolutely.
And you would agree that there's a certain amount of responsibility a supervisor should always feel for the consequences of their decision.
Absolutely. As a supervisor, you're responsible for everything your officer does and their performance and every single call they go to. And you're responsible also usually for their off-duty behavior.
And knowing what you know today, you would agree with me that despite all of this, you made the right decision to pick the right officer to do the job because Officer Perez was that man.
Yes, if I had to do it all over again, I would have to call him again.
Now, you had mentioned, I believe in your direct testimony, about the training that officers undergo regarding the Albuquerque Police Department SOP. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, I don't think the system is actually on. I don't think it's ever turned on.
Well, it's on up here. I don't
Okay.
know if you have to turn on.
Okay, we're up, Your Honor. Thank you.
Now I'd like to have you turn your attention, and it will be on your screen.
Okay.
It's what's been marked as State's Exhibit 1. And I'd like to focus on a particular definition, and that is the definition, or I should say the rule basically that the Albuquerque Police Department officers must follow regarding the use of deadly force. Do you see that in front of you?
I do, sir.
Is that the rule regarding the use of deadly force that applied back in March of 2014?
That is correct.
And that is a rule that was taught to your SWAT team officers, is that right?
That is correct.
Now, what does this rule say about when a police officer can use deadly force?
Would you like me to read it?
Sure.
A reasonable belief that a subject presents an immediate threat to cause serious physical injury to the officer, another officer, or another member of the public.
Now, you would agree with me that a reasonable belief means that an officer knows with, a certain amount of certainty the facts and circumstances which justify their belief that a suspect poses an immediate threat.
Yes.
That a reasonable belief doesn't mean that an officer must act with absolute certainty.
That's correct.
Again, you send officers into a situation in which you have imperfect information. Is that right?
Yes.
And by imperfect, you would agree that officers are sent into situations in which you can't know all of the facts.
Yes, that's even answering calls daily as a field patrolman. You never really know all the facts.
And you would agree with me that when you sent Officer Perez to Mr. Boyd's location, you sent Officer Perez with imperfect information.
That's correct.
There was information that you knew that was communicated to Officer Perez.
Yes,
And that information came over the radio as well as from the CAD reports, is that right?
that's correct.
But there's also information that can be learned from actually being on the scene,
Yes,
and that information isn't always communicated over the radio.
That's correct.
And it isn't always placed in the CADs.
Correct.
So an officer may have educated themselves to the best of their ability with the available information, but you would agree with me that no officer goes into a situation knowing everything that could be known
That's correct.
about the incident in which they're walking into.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that you sent Officer Perez into a situation in which you did not know everything that was going on.
That's correct.
You did not have an understanding of what Officer Weimer-Skirch had planned.
Yes, that's
You
correct.
just simply knew he had a plan.
Correct.
And Officer Perez had no way of knowing what that plan was.
No, he didn't.
That plan was never communicated to Officer Perez.
Not that I believe so, no.
Okay. And you, of course, never heard that plan communicated over the radio.
Correct.
So you were sending Officer Perez into a situation in which a plan had been developed, but Officer Perez had no way of knowing what that plan was.
That's correct.
Now, turning your attention back to the exhibit, State's Exhibit 1. I'm sorry. We talked a little bit about reasonable belief, and now I'd like to focus on another aspect of this. So when a suspect presents an immediate threat to cause serious physical injury, can an officer use deadly force to protect a fellow officer?
Yes,
And it says right there, another officer. You would agree with that?
I do.
So this rule regarding the use of deadly force doesn't simply mean that an officer can protect him or herself from a serious physical threat. Is that right?
That's correct.
An officer has the authority under the Albuquerque Police Department SOPs to use deadly force to protect a fellow officer.
That's correct.
Now, when you teach, or I should say, when you train your SWAT officers, how do you instill in them that rule that we just covered regarding when an Albuquerque Police Department officer can use deadly force?
All of our training is based on the department SOP deadly force section. And every scenario that we put in place, entry training, decisional shoot targets, they're all gauged to test the officer's decision-making, but it all has relevance, and it goes back to the department SOP regarding use of force.
Now, yesterday you were shown a document known as the reactive control model. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
And you would agree with me that this document, which has blue, I think it's like blue, yellow, and red. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do, sir.
That the reactive control model is a training aid.
It's a guide, yes.
So when you say a guide, you would agree with me that the training is, at the very core of this, that training is supposed to instill in officers following the SOP. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that because the reactive control model is a training aid, that is not a replacement for the actual rules of the SOP.
That's right.
You're not held accountable for violating a training aid. You're held accountable for violating the rules in the SOP.
That's correct.
And at all times, the expectation is that you will follow the standard operating procedures. Is that right?
That's expected, yes.
And that's how officers' performance is judged, as to whether they're conforming with the standard operating procedures or not.
That's correct.
So the training aid is helpful to try and explain to an officer how to make decisions. But you would agree with me that those decisions aren't judged on whether they follow the training, but instead as to whether they follow the SOP.
That's correct.
Now, turning your attention back to State's Exhibit 1 and this definition of immediate threat, I'd like to cover with you that definition of immediate threat and how training actually is developed to instill in officers this idea of immediacy. If you would you please read that first sentence?
Immediate threat, an articulate threat that currently exists or may happen within moments, with or without warning.
Now, let me stop you there. I remember yesterday you had mentioned that an officer sometimes has to take action before a suspect actually begins to act. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, would you please explain to the jury why there are situations in which an officer must act before the suspect has acted themselves?
Because based on lag time or reactionary gap, if an officer waits for an attack to begin, he may be physically unable to stop that attack before suffering serious physical injury or death. An officer to stop an attack that can be completed quickly, that officer has to stop the attack before it begins.
Now, you talked about this concept known as physical lag times. I think you just said those words.
Yes, sir.
And I recall you saying those words yesterday. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, there's this concept known as lag time that's taught to officers. Is that right?
Yes.
You would agree with me that it takes, with regards to lag time, that officers are taught, and you were taught, that there's a certain amount of time that it takes for an officer to perceive a threat.
That's correct.
Because it takes our in order to see it, in order to hear it, it takes time for that to occur. Officers are taught that.
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that officers are taught that it takes time to make decisions about what you perceive.
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that once a decision is made, officers are taught that it takes time to act or react.
That's correct.
So, officers are taught about this whole notion or idea known as physical lag times.
Yes.
And they are taught that it takes time to perceive, decide, and act or react.
That's correct.
And you would agree with me, based on your training and experience, that stressful situations slow down the ability to perceive, decide, and react. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Stress does that because it essentially makes it more difficult for you to make those assessments as opposed to situations that aren't stressful.
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that environmental conditions can slow down the ability to perceive, decide, act, and react.
That's correct.
Now, officers are also taught that once a suspect is in motion, there is a lag time that's associated with an officer reacting to the suspect's actions or changing actions.
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that an officer's reaction is always slower than a suspect's actions.
Objection, Your Honor. As long as it's tied to training, I have no objection, but I think he's getting
Okay.
expert testimony from this witness at this point.
Sure, let me have you rephrase it.
You would agree with me that I should back up. I had asked you a series of questions about physical lag times.
That's correct.
And these are all concepts that are taught at the Albuquerque Police Department.
That's correct.
You were taught these concepts as a Albuquerque Police Department officer.
Yes, I was.
And you know that that's what the Albuquerque Police Department teaches its officers about how to understand that sometimes there are attacks that you have to essentially anticipate and act upon before they actually happen.
That's correct.
This is I guess the basis upon which the SOP is based. That because what actually happens, and this is based on your training and experience, is that an officer has to know that they can never act quickly enough, or they can never react quickly enough once a suspect acts.
Yes, you're essentially behind the power curve.
Now, you say behind the power curve. Why do you use those terms?
Because you're always going to be reacting to their action. And again, lag time or reactionary gap, it's going to take you some time to process what you've seen and to physically move into action.
Isn't training supposed to negate physical lag times?
No, I don't think you can really ever negate physical lag times
Why do you say that?
because every situation is unpredictable. Your training is usually, for the most part, you're reacting to someone's action. We try to train you to be prepared and to at least get a heads up on somebody with your tactics, but a lot of times, most of the time, because of what you know at the scene or what you don't know, you're always going to be behind the power curve.
Okay. So you would agree, is this a correct statement, that despite the intensive training a SWAT team officer receives, they will always be behind the power curve when it comes to reacting to a suspect's actions?
in certain situations.
Okay. Now, you would agree with me that Officer Perez is no different than any of the other SWAT team officers you have worked with and have trained.
That's correct.
He has physical lag times built into the way he reacts to the actions of others.
Yes, he does.
And that's simply something that you see among all of your tactical team officers.
Yes, it is.
That's a fact of life as a police officer.
It is.
Now, turning your attention back to the statement that we have with regard to immediate threat, States Exhibit 1, I cut you off. You were reading the immediacy of the threat?
Yes, sir. The immediacy of a threat may be assessed through the following legal standards. Intent. The suspect demonstrates his or her intent to resist being controlled or to inflict physical injury. Gives pre-assault indicators. Means and opportunity. The subject is physically capable of carrying out the perceived threat and is in a position to do so.
So you would agree with me that under the Albuquerque Police Department rules regarding the use of deadly force, that immediate threat is defined by three terms, or three, I guess, ideas. Is that right?
That's correct.
One of them is intent.
That's correct.
The other is means.
That's correct.
And the third is opportunity.
Yes, it is.
Now, I'd like to ask you about the training that you gave your SWAT team officers, including Officer Perez, about how you prepare an officer to essentially determine whether intent, means, and opportunity exist. And I'd first like to begin with intent. What type of training did the SWAT team provide Officer Perez regarding the assessment of a suspect's intent?
Regarding intent, and as far as the training, it's situational awareness.
What is that exactly? What is situational awareness?
Situational awareness is you're focusing on the suspect's words. What do those words mean? You're focusing on the subject's actions. What do those actions tell you will happen next? Those are the type of things we look at during situational awareness.
Now, what's an example from the training that you actually gave Officer Perez that would help Officer Perez make assessments regarding a suspect's intent?
Again, it's repetitive. In every training that we do, it's decisional targets, threat and non-threat targets, role-playing scenarios, entry training, all of the training, all of the tasks that we do as a SWAT team, it's built in there.
So situational awareness is a topic that you cover on a regular basis with your SWAT team officers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, turning your attention to what type of training did the SWAT team provide Officer Perez regarding the assessment of a suspect's means?
When it comes to training for a suspect's means, you're looking at threat identification. What that means is you're focusing on the hands. You're not focusing on the head. The hands that's what's going to kill you. You're focusing on the options available to the suspect as far as weapons. Are there any weapons of opportunity? Those are all of the things that we look for as far as when it comes to the threat identification under the means.
Now, are all Albuquerque Police Department officers, to your knowledge, taught to focus on the hands as opposed to focus on the head or the face?
Yes.
Why is that?
Because a hard stare is not going to kill you. It's not going to hurt you. The hands, that's the danger. Those are the places they can go on your body to retrieve a concealed weapon, to pick up a weapon of opportunity. The hands is the danger.
So when an officer can't see hands, what are officers taught how are they taught to interpret that simple failure to be able to see a suspect's hands?
They usually ask to see the hands of the suspect. Show me your hands.
Why is it dangerous when you can't see a suspect's hands?
Again, does the suspect have a weapon concealed? What are in those hands that's going to hurt myself, a fellow officer, or a member of the community?
Now, you had mentioned this notion called threat identification training. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, how are SWAT team officers trained regarding threat identification?
Again, it's Threat identification is watching the hands, not the head, looking to those options available to the suspect. Are there weapons? Are there weapons of opportunity? We set up scenarios that mimic that. We have threat targets, non-threat targets. Threat targets will usually have their hands either a weapon or it may be just an everyday item. Those officers are tested on decision-making and processing information, and it's done through scenarios, again, entry training. All the training we do incorporates those type of decisions.
Now, I think you used the term decisional shooting. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, you talked about having items, weapons in their hand, and then everyday items. Would you please go into more detail about the decisional shooting targets that are presented to SWAT team officers, including Officer Perez, about making decisions about whether an object is dangerous or whether an object is not?
Again, we try to train for real world. Not everybody we encounter has a weapon. Not everybody we encounter are we going to engage in lethal force. That would be a disservice to the department and the community. Each target represents something from, real life, and that's when the officer has to make split-second decisions. That lag time comes into play because, again, you may round a corner, come into a room, and you see a subject. You have to look at the hands. Do the hands have an everyday newspaper or a camera, or do the hands have something, a weapon that's going to hurt you?
Now, there's also the third item, and that's opportunity. Is that right?
That's correct, sir.
How are SWAT team officers trained to make assessments regarding opportunity?
It's going to be threat response from the officer. And that officer is going to assess lag time or reactionary gap to the threat posed by the suspect. Now,
Yesterday you were asked the question with regards to deadly force training. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, we also didn't have an opportunity to hear about some of your other qualifications. I understand that you were a New Mexico Department of Public Safety certified firearms instructor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, in order to become and I guess I should say, what is the New Mexico Department of Public Safety?
It is the agency who comes up with the requirements that every law enforcement agency must follow. It keeps everybody kind of on the same sheet of music as far as how we do things, and qualifications are kept up there.
Okay. Now, you became a firearms instructor, a certified firearms instructor, is that right?
That's correct.
What does that mean precisely?
That was a school I attended. In that school, I was given lectures, several tests, several practicals. It was the course I went to was intensive. It was 4 weeks long, and we got experience on every type of firearm that a police officer would be in contact with.
So is it fair to say that you're certified to teach firearms to other law enforcement officers?
That's correct.
What firearms are you certified to teach?
Handgun, rifle, and shotgun.
And when you say rifle, what do you mean by that?
It would be the firearm issued by most agencies. It would be the M4 type platform rifle.
Now, is that the M4 or N4?
M4.
N4. Now, is the M4 rifle the rifle that was issued to the Albuquerque Police Department in March of 2014?
That's considered an N4, and it's just because the company designates that as N4. M4 is kind of a trademark by an actual company, but it's basically the same type of platform.
Okay. Now, so you were authorized to instruct officers who used the same rifle that Officer Perez used in the James Boyd shooting. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, based on your training experience, did you teach your SWAT team about the idea or I guess it would be the notion of what is a sight picture.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Would you please explain what a sight picture is with regards to marksmanship?
Objection, insufficient foundation, Your Honor, based on whether this was taught to Perez, and also I think beyond the scope.
I'd ask you to lay a foundational question.
Now, you as a SWAT team sergeant provided training to your officers, is that right?
That's correct. Not personally all the time, but I had other instructors that would, yes.
So how often did the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team train as a unit in 2014?
A minimum of 1 day a week all year long. And then, of course, there was additional weeks where we would do additional training, so multiple hours.
So as a SWAT team sergeant, what was your responsibility overseeing the training that was provided to your SWAT team?
To check on the performance of team members to make sure that the material that was instructed met the criteria of the Albuquerque Police Department as far as use of force, DPS, and all the basics that they've learned in the academy. Nothing with firearms, even being on tactical strays from the basics that you learn in the academy.
So when you, I'm sorry, is it fair to say that marksmanship and marksmanship fundamentals is a topic that is always taught, even to the most advanced officers in the SWAT team?
Yes, again, a tactical officer or a SWAT team officer is good with firearms proficiency just because it's repetitiveness. You do the basics so many times that you become smoother, faster. But it all goes back to the basics of what you learned in your third, fourth week of the basic police academy.
Now, you would agree with me that in your role as a SWAT team sergeant and as a firearms instructor, you and other certified firearms instructors would instruct the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team with regards to marksmanship.
That's correct.
And that you specifically have trained Officer Perez on the fundamentals of marksmanship.
Yes, he's been trained. I don't know if I did it personally, but someone who is an instructor on the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team has.
And you would have overseen all of that training as your role as sergeant.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to ask you the question about sight picture and what would have been taught to Officer Perez with regards to what that means and what that is. What is a sight picture?
Sight picture is your front sight, high center mass on a target. I need to go into a little bit of depth on
I
it.
apologize. I didn't ask probably the question I should have.
That's okay.
Would you please explain to someone who maybe doesn't understand what firearms are and all the different components that they come with so that they can understand what a sight picture is?
Sure. First you have sight alignment.
Excuse me, sir, Fox Judge, I'm just going to make an objection as beyond the scope of
First you'll have sight alignment. Sight alignment is the relationship of the front sight, your rear sight. The top of the front sight and the rear sight should be aligned flush. You should be able to see daylight, equal sides in between the front sight while it's lined up with the rear sight. That's sight alignment. Sight picture is now you are including the rear sight, the front sight, and a target. The way the eye is built, you cannot focus on 3 different things at once, especially at different distances. You have a rear sight that's a different distance from the front sight, and the front sight's a different distance from the target. Therefore, to be accurate, your eye, when the decision is made to shoot, when you bring the firearm up to your eye goes to the target, which is clear, but then will refocus and stay focused on the front sight. Now, keeping that focus on the front sight helps with accuracy, and that front sight is aimed high center mass on the target.
And Your Honor, I'm going to object because I think this is talking about a different kind of sight than what was the one that was used in this particular case. And so it's confusing to the jury.
I think that's
Now, there are certain demonstrative aids that are given to officers with regards how to make assessments about how to create site alignment and eventually a site picture. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'd like to present to you what has been marked Officer Perez Exhibit I-12. And I'd like for you to look at it, and once you've had a chance to look at it,
Okay.
I'd like to ask you some questions about it.
All right.